The steering wheel was cold beneath my fingers, a stark contrast to the burning shame sitting in my throat. I kept my eyes fixed on the passenger window, watching the familiar world of my life, the grocery store where David and I used to shop, the park where he learned to ride his bike, dissolve into a blur of unfamiliar trees and decaying buildings. My own son, the boy I'd raised on lullabies and packed lunches, was taking me to my new home, and the silence between us was a living, suffocating thing. He cleared his throat, a sound that used to precede a little boy's joke or a teenager's request for the car keys, but now it was just the prelude to more hollow justification. "Mom, you have to see it from my perspective," David said, his voice tight, as he turned down a gravel road that crunched like bones under the tires. "The house is quiet, it's safe, it's what we could afford for you right now." Afford. The word landed like a blow. He and his wife, Chloe, had just bought a brand new SUV, a hulking silver thing that cost more than my first house. I said nothing. What was there to say? That my perspective was one of a 68-year-old woman being discarded? That safe felt an awful lot like being hidden away? The car slowed to a stop in front of a small, weathered cottage that seemed to sag under the weight of its own loneliness. The paint was peeling like sunburnt skin, and the front porch steps bowed in the middle, as if tired of holding people up. "It needs a little love, that's all," David muttered, more to himself than to me, as he hauled my 2 suitcases from the trunk, the sum total of my life now, everything else sold or donated to downsize. He carried them inside, his movements brisk and efficient, the way a mover might handle anonymous boxes. He didn't look at the water stain on the ceiling shaped like a continent of sorrow, or the dust motes dancing in the slants of light cutting through the grimy windows. He just set my life down in the middle of the bare living room and finally met my eyes. His were the same hazel as his father's, but where Robert's had always held a warm twinkle, David's were just flat. "The realtor said the neighbors are mostly absent. You'll have your peace and quiet." He pressed a set of cold keys into my hand. "I'll call you in a few days, okay, Mom? Chloe sends her love." And then he was gone. The sound of his car engine faded faster than I thought possible, leaving behind a silence so profound I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I stood there, in the center of that empty room for a long time, just breathing in the smell of dust and neglect. This was it, the final chapter. Not surrounded by grandchildren and the comforting clutter of family photos, but here, in this abandoned-feeling house at the end of a forgotten road. The tears came then, hot and silent, carving paths through the powder on my cheeks. I was so absorbed in my own grief, I almost didn't hear it. The faint, clear, beautiful sound of a violin. It was a simple melody, something old and folk-like, but it was played with such profound sadness that it seemed to speak directly to the shattered pieces of my own heart. It was coming from next door. Through the window, I could see the outline of another cottage, similar to mine but noticeably better cared for, with a tidy garden and curtains in the windows. So, not entirely abandoned, just me. The first 3 days were a lesson in stillness and shadow. I unpacked my meager belongings, the photo albums feeling like anchors of a sunken past. I tried to call David twice. The first time it went to voicemail. The second time, Chloe answered and said brightly, "He's just swamped at work, Linda. You know how it is." I did know. I knew what being swamped meant now. It meant being too busy for the woman who wiped your tears and bandaged your knees. Each afternoon, just as the sun began to dip below the tree line, the music would start next door. It was my only marker of time. That daily concert of sorrow. It wasn't just sad, it was a lament, a heartache given sound. On the 4th day, fueled by a desperate loneliness that outweighed my pride, I baked a batch of lemon blueberry muffins, my mother's recipe, the one that David had always loved. I placed a few on a plate, covered them with a checkered cloth, and walked the short, overgrown path to my neighbor's door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I raised my hand to knock, but the door swung open before my fist could connect. The woman standing there was perhaps a decade older than me, with a fierce, hawk-like gaze and a spine so straight it seemed to defy the very concept of bending. Her hair was a wild, beautiful silver cloud around her head, and she held a wooden mixing spoon like a scepter. "Yes?" she asked, her voice a low, gravelly thing. I stammered, holding out the plate. I'm Linda. I'm your new neighbor. I brought you these." Her sharp eyes flicked from my face to the muffins and back again, and for a terrifying moment I thought she would simply shut the door. Then she reached out a flour-dusted hand and took the plate. "Martha," she said, by way of introduction, "you're the one in the Miller place." It wasn't a question. "I heard you moving in, and I heard you crying." My cheeks flamed. She turned and walked back into her cottage, leaving the door open, an unspoken invitation. Her home was the absolute opposite of mine. Walls lined with crammed bookshelves, vibrant, chaotic paintings, and the smell of herbs and baking bread. It was a life, fully lived. "The crying stops eventually," she stated, not unkindly, as she put the kettle on a cast-iron stove. "Or it doesn't. But you learn to live with the sound of it. Sit." I sat, feeling like a scolded child. "Your playing is beautiful," I whispered. She stilled for a moment, her back to me. "It's how I talk to the people I've lost," she said simply, and the raw truth of it hung in the air between us. We drank our tea in a silence that was no longer uncomfortable, but contemplative. It was the first moment since David drove away that I didn't feel entirely alone. A week later, a loud, frantic knocking jerked me from a shallow sleep. I opened the door to find Chloe, her face pale and streaked with tears, clutching my 1-year-old grandson, Liam, who was wailing, his face flushed a deep, alarming red. "Linda, thank God," she choked out, pushing past me into the house. "It's Liam. He's got a terrible fever. It came on so fast, and David is out of town on a business trip, and I couldn't get the car seat into my friend's car, and the pediatrician's line is busy, and I didn't know where else to go." The words tumbled out in a panicked stream. My grandmotherly instincts, dormant and rusty, kicked into gear. I took Liam from her arms, his small body burning against my chest. "Shh, sweet boy, shh," I murmured, the old, comforting words rising easily to my lips. I looked at Chloe, this woman who had been a willing participant in my exile, and saw not an adversary, but a terrified young mother. And in that moment, the past didn't matter. "Go start my car," I said, my voice calm and firm. The voice I'd used when David had his first asthma attack. "It's the old blue sedan out front. The keys are on the hook. We're taking him to the emergency clinic." As Chloe ran out, I grabbed a blanket and made purse, my hands steady. I knew what to do in a crisis. It was the quiet, everyday betrayals that undid me. Just as I was heading out the door, I saw Martha standing on her porch, watching the scene with her sharp, knowing eyes. She gave me a single, slow nod. It felt like a benediction. The car ride was a blur of Liam's cries and Chloe's quiet sobs. I focused on the road, on the task, on being the steady hand. We spent hours in the bright, sterile clinic. It was a nasty ear infection, the doctor said, but it would be okay with antibiotics. By the time we got back to my little cottage, Liam, medicated and exhausted, was sleeping peacefully in my arms. Chloe looked at me. Her mascara smudged, her defenses completely gone. "Linda, I'm so sorry about all of this," she whispered, gesturing vaguely at the peeling walls. We thought it was for the best." I just nodded, too tired for that conversation now. I made up the old couch for her and set up a makeshift crib for Liam, the familiar rituals of care soothing my own frayed soul. The next morning, as Chloe was preparing to leave, looking embarrassed and grateful, there was a soft knock at the door. It was Martha. She held out a small brown paper bag. "For the little one," she said to Chloe. "Some elderberry syrup. It's good for the immune system." Then she turned her piercing gaze at me. "And for you, Linda. A proper welcome." She handed me a second bag. Inside was a small, handmade ceramic whistle, dark blue with tiny white stars painted on it. "You blow that, and I will come, no matter the hour." She looked from me to Chloe, and her eyes narrowed slightly. "A mother's work is never done, is it? Even when they think they've retired you." With that, she turned and walked back to her house. Chloe stared after her, then at me, a new, unreadable expression on her face. She left soon after, with a quiet thank you and a promise to call David. The house was quiet again, but the silence felt different now. It was filled with the ghost of a baby's cries, the echo of a daughter-in-law's apology, and the lingering, formidable presence of a neighbor who saw everything. I looked down at the whistle in my hand, a simple, solid weight. It felt like a tether to the world of the living. I had been dumped here, left to wither away, but I was beginning to suspect my son had no idea what or who he had left me next to. The days that followed Chloe's visit settled into a new, strange rhythm, the silence of the house now punctuated by the memory of Liam's soft weight in my arms and the solid feel of that ceramic whistle in my pocket, a tiny anchor in my sea of uncertainty. I found myself waiting for Martha's evening violin, not just as a marker of time, but as a conversation I was now a part of, her melodies seeming to ask questions mine couldn't form into words. One afternoon, emboldened by the memory of her kindness during the crisis, I brought over a pot of vegetable soup I'd made from the scant groceries Chloe had insisted on buying for me before she left. A guilt offering I'd accepted with a quiet nod. Martha opened the door before I even knocked, as if she'd been expecting me, and ushered me into her warm, cluttered kitchen. "The soup's for you," I said, setting it on her counter, already crowded with drying herbs in clay pots. "A thank you for the whistle." She grunted, a sound that might have been appreciation, and ladled some into 2 bowls without asking. We sat at her small wooden table, and between slow spoonfuls, she told me about her husband, Arthur, a painter whose vibrant, chaotic works still covered her walls, and who had died of a swift, cruel cancer 5 years prior. "He was the love of my life," she said, her voice rough but steady. "And this music? It's for him. It's the sound of missing someone so much you forget how to breathe without the ache." I looked at her, this fierce, independent woman, and saw my own reflection. A different kind of loss, but the same hollowed-out space where family used to be. "My son," I started, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "David. He was my whole world after Robert passed. I worked 2 jobs to put him through college. I never missed a single baseball game. And now—" I couldn't finish, the betrayal too fresh. Martha fixed me with that hawk-like gaze. "Children have a way of rewriting history to suit their new narratives, Linda. They forget the sacrifices. They only remember the imperfections. My daughter, Eleanor, she lives in Paris now, sends a postcard at Christmas. Thinks I'm too old to understand her artistic life." She snorted. "She doesn't know I still have the first miserable ashtray she made me in kindergarten." It was the first time she'd mentioned a child, and the revelation that this formidable woman also knew the sting of a distant child was a twist that lodged deep in my chest, making me feel less alone in my specific brand of heartbreak. A week later, the phone rang, David's name flashing on the screen. My heart did a painful little stutter, a mixture of hope and dread. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, my voice carefully neutral. "Hello, David?" There was a pause on the other end, the sound of him choosing his words. "Mom, Chloe told me what happened with Liam. She said you were amazing. Thank you for that." The gratitude felt like a bandage on a gaping wound. "He's my grandson," I said simply, the unspoken, "Unlike you, I don't abandon my family." hanging heavily between us. He cleared his throat, that familiar sound that now grated. Right. Well, listen, Chloe and I were talking. We think it might be good for you to have a more structured living situation. There's a place called Sunny Meadows. It's an assisted living facility. Really nice, Mom, with activities and people your own age. The words washed over me, cold and clinical. Sunny Meadows. It sounded like a cemetery for the living. He was trying to box me away, to make me someone else's problem permanently. The betrayal was so complete, so utter, that for a moment I couldn't speak. I just stared out the window at Martha's cottage, at the vibrant, stubborn life she cultivated there. I am not going to Sunny Meadows, David, I said, my voice trembling but firm. This is my home now. He sighed, the exasperated sigh I'd heard 1,000 times when he was a teenager and I'd asked him to clean his room. Mom, be reasonable. That house is falling apart. It's not safe for you to be alone out there. Alone. The word was a knife. He had made me alone. I am not alone, I whispered, and before he could reply, I hung up the phone, my hands shaking so badly that I had to clutch the edge of the sink to steady myself. The silence in the house was deafening, but then, as if on cue, the first notes of Martha's violin drifted through the walls, a slow, determined melody that felt less like a lament and more like a battle cry. The next day, I decided to fight back in the only way I knew how, by putting down roots, however small, in this neglected soil. I dragged a rickety wooden chair onto the porch and started scrubbing the grime from the windows, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the ache in my heart. Martha emerged from her house, holding 2 trowels and a packet of seeds. "The soil's good here," she announced, without preamble. "A little neglected, but good. You're going to plant a garden." It wasn't a suggestion. For the next few hours, we worked side by side, turning the earth in a small patch next to my porch. Her movements efficient and sure, mine clumsy but determined. The sun warmed my back, and for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something other than despair, a sense of purpose. As we planted marigolds and zinnias, Martha said, "You know, the man who used to own this place, old Mr. Miller, was a friend of Arthur's. He was a quiet man, kept to himself, but he had a son who visited sometimes. A sharp-dressed man, always in a hurry." She paused, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. "Saw him out here a few months before old Miller passed, talking with a real estate agent. The son, I mean. Didn't look too broken up about his father being gone." A cold dread began to creep up my spine. "What was the son's name?" I asked, though I already knew the answer, the pieces clicking into place with a horrifying clarity. Martha looked at me, her eyes holding a world of pity and understanding. "He introduced himself once, said his name was David. David Miller." The world tilted. Miller. This wasn't just some random, cheap rental David had found for me. This was a house he owned. He had inherited it from a man I never knew he had a connection to, a man who shared his last name. My son hadn't just dumped me in an abandoned house, he had dumped me in a house that was rightfully his, a secret asset, and he was now trying to push me into a home so he could sell it, unburdened by his mother. The garden soil beneath my fingers suddenly felt like grave dirt. I looked at Martha, my vision blurring with tears of a new, more profound betrayal. She reached out, her dirt-stained hand covering mine. "The walls have ears, Linda," she said softly, "and sometimes they have stories to tell. You just have to know how to listen." The ground beneath my knees seemed to fall away, the freshly turned soil no longer feeling like hope, but like the evidence of a crime scene. David Miller. He hadn't just rented this hovel for me, he owned it. He'd inherited it, hidden it from me, and now saw me as the final obstacle to liquidating it, to erasing this last, inconvenient piece of his secret history. The betrayal was so much colder, so much more calculated than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just a son being selfish, it was a deliberate, premeditated erasure. Martha's hand on mine was the only thing keeping me from spiraling into the abyss. Her grip was firm, grounding. He never told me, I whispered, the words ash in my mouth. All those years, after Robert died, it was just us. We told each other everything, or so I thought. Martha helped me to my feet, her arm a surprisingly strong support. Men like that, she said, her voice low and fierce, they build their new lives on the silence of the old ones. They think if they don't say the words, the past doesn't exist. She led me into my own kitchen, sat me down at the small table, and put the kettle on. I stared at the water stain on the ceiling, now seeing it not as a mark of neglect, but as a symbol of the decay David had willingly moved me into. For the next 2 days, I moved through the cottage like a ghost, the knowledge of David's deception a poison in my veins. Every splinter in the floorboard, every rattle of the loose window frame was a testament to his lie. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. The violin music from next door changed. It was no longer a lament for Arthur, but a sharper, more urgent sound, a call to arms. On the third morning, there was a firm knock. It was Martha, holding a cardboard box. "Get dressed," she commanded. "We're going into town. You're going to help me with some errands, and then we're going to the library." The library? I wanted to curl back into bed, to wallow in the devastating truth, but the look in her eyes brooked no argument. The town was a 10-minute drive away, a small, quaint place with a single main street. Walking beside Martha was like being with a local celebrity. People nodded, waved, called out her name. She introduced me simply as my neighbor, Linda, and the way she said it carried a weight of belonging that made my eyes prickle. At the hardware store, she bought a new lock for my front door. "For your peace of mind," she stated. And I knew it was a shield against the son who owned the house. Then we went to the library, a grand old building that smelled of old paper and polish. Martha led me to a row of microfilm machines. "Property records," she said, her voice dropping, "and old local newspapers. If you want to know the story, Linda, you have to be willing to read it." My hands trembled as I loaded the first reel, the one for the year old Mr. Miller passed away. The truth, it turned out, was even more shattering than the lie. The obituary was short and unremarkable. Harold Miller, 78, passed away peacefully at home. He is survived by his son, David Miller of Crestview. Crestview was the affluent suburb where my David lived, the same David. But it was a small article a few weeks later that stole the breath from my lungs. It was about the quiet settlement of Harold Miller's estate, noting that his son, David, a financial advisor from Crestview, had inherited the property. The article mentioned that Harold had been a retired accountant, a quiet man who had lived in the cottage for over 40 years. And then I saw it, a grainy, decades-old photo from a community picnic. It showed a younger Harold Miller with a warm, shy smile, standing next to a woman who made my blood run cold. It was my mother-in-law, Eleanor, Robert's mother, the woman who had never approved of me, who had told Robert he could do better than a girl from a working-class family. She had died when David was just a baby. According to the family's story, she and Robert's father had been devoted to each other until his early death. But the caption beneath the photo read, "Harold Miller and Eleanor Stevens enjoy the summer festivities." Stevens was her maiden name. The timeline didn't make sense. Robert's father had been dead for 5 years by the date of that photo. I felt the world lurch. Martha, reading over my shoulder, let out a soft, sharp breath. "Oh, my dear girl," she whispered. The pieces, horrific and unbelievable, began to snap together. Harold Miller wasn't just a random man David had hidden from me. Harold Miller was David's grandfather. Robert was not his father. The man I had loved, the man I had grieved for over a decade, was not my son's biological father. And David had known. He had always known. The abandonment, the coldness, the ease with which he could discard me, it all made a terrible, brutal sense now. I wasn't just an inconvenient mother. I was a living reminder of a lie he had built his entire identity upon. I don't remember the drive home. I sat in Martha's passenger seat, the world outside the window a meaningless blur. The foundation of my entire life, my marriage, my motherhood, my grief, had been built on quicksand. Robert, my sweet, funny Robert, had he known? Or had he, like me, lived a life of loving deception? When we got back to my cottage, I walked numbly to the hall closet and pulled out the one box I hadn't been able to unpack, the box labeled Robert. I lifted out his old leather wallet, worn soft from years in his pocket. I'd kept it as a relic, something that still held the shape of him. With trembling fingers, I opened the coin compartment, a place I hadn't looked in 20 years. Tucked behind a few old pennies was a small folded square of paper. It was a note, in my mother-in-law's elegant, looping handwriting. "Robert," it read, "he is your responsibility now. He is a miller. Keep him safe, and never tell him." The paper crinkled in my tight grip. Robert had known. From the very beginning, he had known. He had raised another man's son as his own. He had loved him unconditionally, and he had taken the secret to his grave. And David? David had found out. He had learned the truth, and in doing so had rewritten his entire history, erasing Robert and me in the process. We were no longer his parents. We were the custodians of a lie. I looked up at Martha, who was watching me with a profound sorrow and unwavering strength. "What do I do?" I breathed, the question a plea. Martha's eyes hardened. "You live," she said, her voice like iron. "You live in this house that is rightfully yours through the love and sacrifice of the man you called your husband. You plant your garden, and you wait. Because a secret this big doesn't stay buried forever. It always, always comes knocking." The weight of the note in my hand was heavier than any stone I could have pulled from the garden. Robert had known. The man I shared a bed with for 23 years, the man I built a life with, had carried this secret in his pocket, literally pressed against his hip every single day. And he'd never once faltered. He'd never looked at David with anything less than utter adoration. He'd coached his t-ball games, helped him with his algebra, taught him how to shave, all the while holding this truth between them. Was that his strength or my blindness? I felt the ghost of his love around me, but now it felt different. Not less, but more complex, more sacrificial. He hadn't just been a husband and father. He'd been a guardian of a painful truth, and he'd done it to give a little boy a normal life. And David, what had he seen when he discovered it? Had he only felt the betrayal of the lie and never seen the immense, quiet love that perpetuated it? Martha stayed with me late into the night, not speaking, just sitting in the companionable silence of shared understanding. She made us a simple dinner of scrambled eggs and toast, the kind of meal you make when the world has ended and you still have to feed the body. "The garden will need weeding tomorrow," she said finally, as she stood to leave. "The weeds don't care about your heartbreak. They just grow. It's a good lesson." I nodded, clinging to the mundane task like a lifeline. After she left, the silence of the cottage was no longer accusing, it was waiting. I was waiting. I took the ceramic whistle from my pocket and held it tight, its solid, cool presence a promise that I wasn't facing this alone. The next morning, I woke with a resolve that felt fragile, like the first ice on a puddle, but it was there. I went out to the garden and I weeded. I attacked the stubborn dandelions and crabgrass with a fury, my hands digging into the earth,
the physical exertion a purge for my soul. Each weed pulled felt like a piece of the lie being torn out. Martha came out and worked beside me, and we didn't talk about David or Harold Miller or the devastating note. We talked about the best way to stake tomatoes and whether marigolds really kept away rabbits. It was the most healing conversation I'd had in years. Days turned into a week. The flowers began to sprout, tiny green promises pushing through the dark soil. I started cleaning the cottage, not as a prisoner tidying her cell, but as a woman claiming her space. I scrubbed the water stain on the ceiling until it faded to a faint memory. I fixed the wobbly leg on the kitchen table with a folded piece of cardboard, a trick Robert had taught me. I was no longer Linda, the discarded mother. I was Linda, the woman who lived in the Miller house, who was planting a garden with her friend Martha. The identity was new, and it fit raw and uncomfortable, but it was mine. The call came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. It was David again. This time his voice was different, strained, almost nervous. "Mom, we need to talk. About the house. About things." I could hear Chloe in the background, her voice a tense, urgent murmur. "There's nothing to talk about, David," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm not going to Sunny Meadows. The subject is closed." "It's not about that anymore," he said, and the frustration in his tone was now edged with something else. Panic. "Chloe, she found some old papers. From Harold Miller's files. We need to come see you." So the secret was cracking open from the inside. Chloe, with her bright, efficient curiosity, had stumbled into the truth he'd tried to bury. A cold calm settled over me. Martha was right. The secret had come knocking.
"Come then," I said, and hung up the phone. I walked to the window and looked out at the rain-drenched garden, at the vibrant life next door where Martha was no doubt watching. The storm was coming, but for the first time, I didn't feel like I would be washed away. I felt rooted. I felt ready. The rain fell in a soft, steady hush, blurring the lines between the overgrown yard and the dense woods beyond, wrapping the world in a gray, waiting stillness. I sat at the small kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold, watching the driveway. Martha knew they were coming. I'd seen her curtain twitch, a silent signal of her vigilance. She wouldn't intervene unless I blew the whistle, but her presence was a fortress at my back. When David's silver SUV finally crunched up the gravel, its sleek lines looking alien and aggressive in this muted, natural landscape, my heart didn't flutter with nervous hope anymore. It beat a slow, heavy, determined rhythm. This was no longer a plea from a mother to a son. This was a reckoning. He got out first, pulling his jacket over his head, his shoulders hunched against the rain, not like a man seeking shelter, but like one bracing for a blow. Martha scrambled from the passenger side, holding a folder stuffed with papers protectively against her chest, her face a pale, anxious oval. They hurried onto the porch, and I waited a full 3 seconds after the knock before I opened the door. The sight of them standing there, huddled and damp on the threshold of the house David secretly owned, sent a fresh wave of that cold calm through me. "Come in," I said, my voice neutral, stepping back to let them pass. The familiarity of their presence in this strange space was jarring. David's eyes darted around, taking in the clean floors, the mended table, the single vase of wildflowers I'd picked that morning. He saw the life I was building here, and it clearly unnerved him. "Mom," he began, wiping rain from his face, a gesture so familiar it ached. "We need to talk." Chloe was going through some of our important documents, trying to get things organized for taxes, and she found other things in a locked box I had. His voice was tight, a thin wire of control stretched to its limit. Chloe stepped forward,
her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a desperate need for explanation. It was a birth certificate, Linda, for David. It lists the father as Harold Miller. She looked from me to David, her face pleading. And there were letters from a woman named Eleanor to Harold. They loved each other. David's grandmother. The truth was out, lying bare and ugly on my clean floor. I looked at my son, at the man who had traded his true, loving history for a clean, convenient lie. I said, "And you knew?" Not asking. "You knew, and you said nothing. You just moved me into your biological grandfather's house and tried to shove me into a home so you could sell it and be done with the whole messy business." David's face flushed a deep, angry red. "What was I supposed to do, Mom?" he exploded, the controls snapping. "Come to you and say, 'Hey, by the way, the man you thought was my father wasn't, and my whole life is a lie'? Robert wasn't my father. You both lied to me every single day." His shout echoed in the small room, a tempest of long-suppressed fury, and in that moment I saw not the successful, cold man he'd become, but the little boy who'd discovered a truth that shattered his world and had nowhere to put the pieces. But my sympathy was a finite resource, and he had exhausted it. "Robert was your father," I said, my own voice rising, sharp and clear as broken glass. "In every way that mattered. He changed your diapers. He held you when you were sick. He worked double shifts to pay for your braces. He loved you more than anything on this earth. Harold Mimmer was a name on a piece of paper. Robert was the man who held your hand when you learned to walk." I was crying now, hot, angry tears for the man I loved, for the sacrifice he had made that was now being spat upon. "He knew from the beginning, David. His mother forced that baby you on him, and he took you. He loved you as his own. He chose you every single day. He chose you." The fight seemed to go out of David all at once. He sank onto my rickety sofa as if his legs could no longer hold him. He stared at the floor, his shoulders slumping. Martha moved to his side, her hand on his back, her eyes filled with the dawning horror as the full weight of the story settled on her. "He knew?" David whispered, the anger replaced by a bewildered hurt. "All that time? He knew?" I walked to the hall closet, my movements slow and deliberate, and retrieved Robert's wallet from the box. I unfolded the fragile note and handed it to him. I watched his face as he read his grandmother's words, the command to keep the secret, to never tell him. He looked up at me, his hazel eyes, Robert's eyes, filled with a confusion so profound it was almost childlike. He asked, "Why?" The single word contained a world of pain. And in that moment, the manipulative son was gone, and I saw the little boy I'd raised, lost and looking for his mother. The rain beat its steady rhythm on the roof, a sound that was no longer lonely, but cleansing, washing the gravel drive, the overgrown garden, and the three of us, waiting in the quiet heart of the storm.
The silence in the wake of his question was heavier than the rain on the roof. Why? It was the question that had haunted me too, since I'd found the note. Why had Robert shouldered this alone? Why had he never trusted me with this monumental secret? But looking at my son, now so small and broken on my couch, the answer wasn't about me anymore. It was about him. "Because he was protecting you, David," I said, my voice softening, the anger leaching away to be replaced by a profound, weary sorrow. "His mother gave him a choice: take you in as his own, give you his name, and never, ever tell you the truth, or she would ensure you were given to Harold, a man you didn't know, and you'd grow up as the secret, illegitimate son of a lonely accountant. Robert chose you. He chose to be your father so completely that the lie became his truth." I sat down in the chair opposite him, the space between us feeling like a canyon we were only just beginning to see across. "He didn't do it to deceive you. He did it to give you a whole life, a life without that shadow."
David stared at the note, his finger tracing the faded ink of his grandmother's handwriting. "All these years," he murmured, his voice thick. "I thought I was honoring him, building the life he wanted for me, the big house, the successful career, the perfect family." He glanced at Chloe, whose expression was a mixture of pity and dawning understanding. "When I found those papers, after Chloe and I got engaged, it felt like the world cracked open. Everything I thought I was, everything I'd worked for, felt like it was built on a lie. Robert wasn't my father. I was the product of some secret affair my grandmother had. I felt like an imposter in my own life." He finally looked at me, and the raw pain in his eyes was the most honest thing I'd seen from him in years. "And you were part of it. You were the keeper of the lie. Being near you, it was like being near the proof of everything I was trying to forget. So I pushed you away. I thought if I could just put you somewhere out of sight, I could finally breathe. I could finally be the person I was supposed to be." His confession hung in the air, a tragic mirror of my own feelings of being discarded. He hadn't just been cold and calculating. He had been terrified and lost, a boy trying to outrun a ghost. "The person you were supposed to be was the son Robert and I raised, the kind boy who loved building model airplanes and who cried at the end of Old Yeller. This house, David, did you think hiding me here would hide the truth from yourself?" He shook his head, a slow, defeated movement. "I don't know what I thought. It was cheap. It was available. It felt fitting in a twisted way, stashing the past in the past's house." He let out a long, shuddering breath. "I'm sorry, Mom. For the house, for everything. I was so wrong." The words were simple, but they were the first real, unguarded words he'd spoken to me in a decade. They didn't erase the pain, but they laid a foundation over the chasm between us. Chloe reached out and took my hand, her own tears falling freely now. "We're so sorry, Linda," she whispered. Outside, the rain began to slow, its persistent drumbeat fading into a gentle patter, as if the storm itself was finally passing. The three of us sat together in the quiet of the cottage, not as a broken family, but as people who had finally stopped running from the same devastating truth, and in the stillness, found the first fragile possibility of beginning again.
The silence that settled after David's apology was not the empty, aching void of before, but a fragile, living thing, delicate as a spider's web after the rain. We sat there, the three of us, surrounded by the ghosts of Robert and Harold and Eleanor, and for the first time, the ghosts felt quiet, no longer screaming to be heard. David finally lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "This house," he began, his voice raspy. "I hated coming here as a kid. Harold was quiet. He'd just watch me. I never understood why until I found those papers. I thought he was judging me, but now—" He trailed off, looking around the living room as if seeing it for the first time. "Now I think he was just trying to memorize me." The insight was so unexpected, so deeply empathetic that it stole my breath. It was a crack in the shell of the selfish man he'd become, revealing the sensitive boy I remembered. Chloe, ever the practical one, gently squeezed my hand. "Linda, you can't stay here," she said, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought she was going to bring up Sunny Meadows again. But her expression was soft, concerned. "This place is so isolated, and it's filled with all of this now. It's not a home. It's a monument to a painful secret." I looked from her earnest face to David's, which was now filled with a dawning, determined remorse. "This is my home," I said again, but the words had a new weight to them. "For now. I have a garden to tend to." I managed a small, wobbly smile.
And I have a friend next door who would hunt you both down with her violin bow if you tried to move me." A faint, real smile touched David's lips for the first time in years. "Martha," he said, almost to himself. "I remember her. She gave me a cookie once when I was hiding out here from you and Dad after a fight. It tasted like sawdust and kindness." The memory, so specific and human, was another bridge between our then and now. They left as the rain finally ceased, the late afternoon sun breaking through the clouds to set the wet world glittering. The goodbye was awkward, a clumsy hug from David that felt both strange and familiar, a promise from Chloe to bring Liam out to see the garden soon. I stood on the porch and watched their car disappear, the sound of the engine fading, but this time, the silence that returned was different. It was a peace offering. Later, as I was watering the new seedlings, Martha appeared at the fence. "The storm passed," she stated, her sharp eyes missing nothing. I nodded. It did. For now. She leaned on the fence post. "The boy looked lighter. You both did." She didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer them. Some stories are too tender to be told all at once. She simply nodded toward my garden. "Those zinnias need more sun. We'll build a proper raised bed tomorrow. Can't have the past choking out the future." And with that, she turned and went back inside, leaving me with the golden light of the setting sun and the profound sense that the ground beneath my feet, for so long unstable, had finally begun to firm up. The next week was a strange and beautiful limbo. David called every other day, not out of duty, but with a tentative curiosity. He asked about the garden. He asked if I needed anything from the hardware store. He asked, his voice hesitant, what my favorite memory of Robert was. We talked for 20 minutes about the time Robert tried to build a treehouse and it collapsed with him in it, and we laughed. A real, genuine laugh that felt like breathing after being underwater for a very long time. I was tilling the soil for the new raised bed when a familiar car pulled up again. This time, it was Chloe and Liam. My grandson toddled into the yard on unsteady legs, his face no longer flushed with fever, but bright with curiosity. He pointed a chubby finger at a bright yellow marigold and said, "Pretty." The word was a balm on my soul. Chloe watched him, her eyes shining. "He loves it out here. It's so real." As Liam stumbled through the rows of plants, his little hands brushing against the leaves, I saw the future Martha had spoken of. It wasn't in a sterile, assisted living facility. It was right here, in this messy, complicated, beautiful patch of earth, with the past weeded, but not forgotten. A new life, in so many forms, finally taking root. The sight of Liam's small, earnest face buried in the petals of a marigold, his little body swaying with the pure joy of discovery, did something to the hardened, calcified places in my soul. It was as if his tiny hands were gently breaking apart the stone of my grief, allowing something green and tender to push through. Chloe watched, her arms crossed, but not in the defensive way I was used to. This was a posture of quiet contentment. "He needs this," she said softly, more to herself than to me. "He needs a place to get dirty, to just be." I nodded, my throat too tight for words. This was what Robert had wanted, I realized with a sudden, piercing clarity. Not the sterile perfection of David's curated life, but this, messy, real, and connected. This was the legacy he'd tried to build. After they left, the cottage didn't feel empty. It felt expectant. I found myself looking at the walls not with despair, but with a critical eye. If Liam was going to be spending time here, it needed to be a home, not a waiting room. The next time David called, our conversation was different. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about the future. "The porch steps are a death trap," I told him, no accusation in my voice. just a statement of fact. And the railing is loose. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the financial advisor calculating the cost, the son weighing the obligation. But then he said, "I'll come out on Saturday with my tools. We can fix them." We. The word was so small, but it was a cornerstone. Saturday arrived, bright and clear. David's car pulled up, not with the hesitant crunch of before, but with a purposeful roll. He got out, dressed in old jeans and a faded college t-shirt, a toolbox in his hand. It was a version of my son I hadn't seen in 15 years. For a few hours, we worked in a comfortable, focused silence, broken only by the whine of a saw and the steady tap, tap, tap of a hammer. He showed me how to properly brace the rotten step, his hands confident and capable. I held the wood steady, and for the first time in a long time, we were a team. It was while we were taking a break, sitting on the now sturdy steps with glasses of iced tea, that the past nudged its way back in, not as a weapon, but as a puzzle we were both trying to solve. "I went to the cemetery," David said, his eyes fixed on the tree line. "I visited both of them, Robert's grave and Harold's. I stayed quiet, letting him find the words. I stood at Harold's plot and I felt nothing, just a stranger's name on a stone. Then I went to Dad's, to Robert's." His voice cracked. "And I told him I was sorry. I told him I finally understood the choice he made. And it felt like he heard me." He looked at me, his eyes shining. "I miss him, Mom. I miss him so much. It hurts." And there, on the porch of the house that held all our secrets, my son finally grieved for the man who had been his father in every way that counted.
Later that evening, after David had left, Martha came over bearing 2 bowls of homemade stew. We ate on my kitchen table, and I told her about the day, about the repaired steps and the breakthrough with David. She listened, her hawk-like eyes soft. "Good," she said simply. "Now the real work begins. Forgiveness isn't a feeling, Linda. It's a structure you build together, every day. It's a lot like this porch. You have to keep checking for rot, and you have to keep reinforcing the foundations." She pushed her bowl away. "I have something for you." She handed me a small framed photograph. It was the grainy newspaper photo of Harold Miller and Eleanor at the picnic, but Martha had cleaned it up, enlarged it, and framed it in a simple wood frame. "He was a part of the story," she said. "You don't have to hang it on the wall, but you shouldn't hide him in a box anymore either. Acknowledge the truth. All of it. That's how you take its power away." I held the frame, looking at the shy smile of the man who was David's biological grandfather, a man who had loved and lost, just like the rest of us. He wasn't a villain. He was just a piece of the puzzle. I didn't know where to put the picture, so for now I set it on the kitchen windowsill where the morning sun would touch it. It was a part of the story, but it no longer defined our story. A few days later, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. It was from David. Inside were the official, signed deeds to the cottage, transferred solely into my name. There was no note, no grand explanation. The legal documents said everything that needed to be said. This was no longer his secret asset. It was my home. I stood holding those papers, the weight of them in my hands, a tangible symbol of the trust we were slowly, painstakingly rebuilding. That night, the violin music from next door was different. It wasn't a lament or a battle cry. It was a hymn, slow and sweet and full of a hard-won peace. I looked around the cottage, at the repaired porch, the new garden bed, the photograph on the windowsill, and the deed on the table. It was still small, still simple, but it was filled to the brim with a future I had thought was lost. The past had tried to bury me here, but instead it had given me the seeds of a new beginning. The deed on my kitchen table was more than a piece of paper. It was an absolution, a returning of the narrative of my life into my own hands. I ran my fingers over the raised notary seal, the official ink stating what I now felt in my bones. This was mine. The silence that night was a comfortable one, a blanket around my shoulders as I sat on the repaired porch steps, listening to the crickets and the distant, hopeful notes of Martha's violin. The next morning, I woke with a purpose that was entirely my own. I walked into town, to the same hardware store Martha had taken me to, and bought a gallon of paint the color of sunshine. I was going to paint the kitchen, not because David told me to, or because I was hiding from anything, but because I wanted to look at something bright while I drank my morning coffee. When I returned, brush and roller in hand, I found a small, weathered notebook tucked into my screen door. There was no name, but I knew it was from Martha. Inside, in her precise, looping script, were recipes, not for food, but for simple, natural things. A polish for wood made from lemon juice and olive oil, a spray for the garden to keep bugs away using garlic and soak, a tea for sleepless nights made from chamomile and a touch of lavender. It was a manual for maintaining a life, offered without ceremony. It was her way of saying, I see you building, and here are some tools. I spent the afternoon painting, the vibrant yellow transforming the once gloomy kitchen into a space that seemed to hold the light long after the sun had moved on. The physical act of covering the old, stained walls felt like a metaphor so powerful it almost hurt. David's visits became a new ritual, no longer fraught with tension, but filled with a quiet, shared mission. He came the following weekend, and when he saw the yellow kitchen, he stopped in his tracks. A slow smile spread across his face. "Dad would have hated this," he said, and then we both laughed, because it was true. Robert had been a man of beiges and browns. "He'd say it was too loud," he added, shaking his head fondly. The mention of Robert was no longer a landmine. It was a shared memory, a touchstone we could both visit without flinching. We started working on the spare bedroom, a tiny room I'd been using for storage. We cleared it out together, and as we pulled boxes from the closet, we found an old cardboard box labeled David's School Stuff. Inside was a time capsule of his childhood, report cards, faded drawings, and a stack of essays. He sat on the floor, his long legs folded, and read one aloud. It was about his hero, and he'd written about Robert, about how his dad had taught him that being strong meant being kind, that real men weren't afraid to show love. His voice broke as he read his own childish words. "I forgot I wrote this," he whispered. "I forgot I knew that." It was another piece of himself, long buried, that he was reclaiming. One evening, Chloe and Liam came for dinner. I made a simple pasta, and we ate at the small table in the yellow kitchen. Liam sat in a high chair David had brought over, smashing marinara sauce into his hair with gleeful abandon. The conversation was easy, flowing from Liam's latest antics to the plans for the spare room. Chloe thought it would make a perfect playroom for when they visited. "We could get a little toddler bed for him in here," she said, her eyes sparkling. "Make it his special grandma house room." The words grandma house settled around me, warm and sure. This wasn't just my home, it was becoming a cornerstone for my grandson's world, a place of messy meals and sunny walls and a garden to explore. After they left, I stood in the doorway of the small room, imagining it filled with toys and the sound of Liam's laughter. The abandoned house was gone. In its place was a home, being built, day by day, not on a foundation of lies, but on one of hard-won truth and a love that had been bent but never broken. The seasons turned, the zinnias in the garden blooming into a riot of color that lasted until the first frost. My life had found a rhythm I never could have imagined. Mornings in the garden with Martha, afternoons puttering in my cottage, and weekends often punctuated by the sound of my family's voices filling the rooms. The past was not forgotten. It was integrated, a part of the story, but no longer the whole book. I had thought being dumped here was the end of everything. I now understood it was the brutal, painful beginning of something new. I had my home, my friend, and the fragile, growing tendrils of my family finding their way back to me. The story wasn't about abandonment anymore. It was about return.